So what do you make of the criticism that, Zuckerberg didn't answer all the questions and said he would get back to them about a lot of the questions, which we still don't know if we're going to get those answers?
Well, I think it was very good that he went. It was very good that he agreed to speak before the European Parliament. And it was good that he heard at first hand some of the strong feelings there are amongst European politicians about these issues around privacy and around use of data. The question of the format was something decided by the Parliament. I think it probably would have been impossible to answer all those questions in the time allotted. I think this is part of an ongoing dialogue. We're having other contacts with Facebook. I think they know that there are issues, and these are complicated issues. So I think this was a good first step in opening a dialogue, and I'm sure there will be more.
One of the questions was, convince me you're not a monopoly and why we shouldn't break up Facebook. And he talked about how Facebook faces stiff competition, and yet this is a company with 2 billion users that owns 3 of the other major social networks, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp. What could the EU conceivably do to address the monopoly question? And how
I think
likely
it's very important
is that?
to understand that EU anti-monopoly law is not run on a political basis. It's not run by the European Parliament or even by the member states. It's run by the European Commission on the basis of well-established rules about dominant position and so forth. So I think the issue of abuse of dominant position or monopoly inquiries under the antitrust laws are a matter for the European Commission to conduct in the usual way. So I don't think this is something which enters into the political domain. And
they've been quite aggressive when talking about companies like Google in particular. Do you think they could take a greater interest in Facebook?
I have no idea, because it depends on what the facts would say. I mean, anti-monopoly and antitrust legislation and action is based on objective facts. It's based on analysis. So I think this is not something that's just going to be driven by political concerns. And the cases you've referred to have been the result of long investigations and in a very transparent and open way. So I have great faith in the objectivity of our antitrust activities.
We're just days away from GDPR going into effect. How will we really know if Facebook is complying and other companies?
Well, the answer is that the rules are there. It would be eventually for people who feel that their data is not being properly protected to make a complaint, or for someone to introduce a complaint to one of the data protection authorities. Then there would have to be an examination. The company would be given the opportunity to respond. And, if I may say so, Emily, you talked about these fines. This would be a fine will be the instrument of last resort at the end of a process in which companies have been asked to explain whether they're compliant, whether they're not compliant, why they're not compliant. So I don't think there's any risk that companies are going to find themselves suddenly out of the blue subject to heavy fines without there being due process and the time given to respond to any concerns there may be.
So on this note, you've made the argument that companies could actually be more innovative as a result of GDPR, but there's also small businesses that have said they've been put out of business as a result of this. Does that concern you?
I'm not aware of anyone who's been put out of business. Let's be clear, the GDPR, which enters into force on Friday, is not substantially different from the privacy directive we've had in 1995. It does introduce some new procedures, and it does introduce the element of enforcement through fines. But we've had a 2-year period for people to get used to this and to prepare. So, frankly, I think there is perhaps a little too much hype about the possible impact of this. It's evolution rather than revolution, and I believe that most companies have been able to adapt and prepare for this in an orderly way.
Do you think the U.S. will or should enact similar legislation?
That's for the U.S. to decide. I note that nearly 120 countries around the world have overarching data privacy rules based on the same principles as the GDPR, which in fact were based on OECD principles established 20 years ago. It's for the U.S. to decide whether they want to go down that road. They are a little bit the exception today.
And with ongoing elections in Europe, we've been talking about the primaries here in the United States. Are you satisfied with what Facebook's done so far to clean up its act when it comes to election meddling?
Well, that's not for me to judge. I mean, I understand that, as Mr. Zuckerberg said yesterday, they have already taken some action in the area of election activity. But this is an ongoing debate. I think it's a complex debate, and I think it's going to take more time to figure out how the potential abuse of social media platforms in attempts to influence elections or other plebiscite results, it needs to be countered in the most transparent and effective way possible.
Now, we have to talk about trade, and the EU's exclusion from the steel and aluminum tariffs expires June 1st. Where do talks stand?
Well, we are still in conversations. Cecilia Malmström, the European Union Trade Commissioner, is in regular contact with Secretary Ross. Our position is that we do not believe that European exports of steel and aluminium pose any threat to American national security or even to the American economy. We're the second largest exporter by volume and the largest exporter by value. In many cases, we export very specialized products which can't even be obtained here in the United States. And these are inputs to American companies producing products frequently then used by the auto industry or other companies. So we think our exports are good for America. We don't see why they should be subject to tariffs. We don't see why they should be subject to any volume restriction. And that's our position. We wait to see what the President's decision finally will be. And in the same context, we have said that we are willing to discuss other trade issues that the U.S. may wish to put on the table, such as industrial tariffs, but only once we have settled this issue of the exemption, a permanent exemption for steel and aluminium.
How optimistic are you that you will get that permanent exemption?
I honestly don't know. We've made our case. We believe it's a good case, but we understand that there are pressures going in other directions, and we will wait to see what the President and the administration decide.
Would you tolerate quotas, and if so, at what level?
We have said that we would be willing to see what would happen if there were to be a tariff rate quota set at 100% of existing trade. So in other words, no diminution of our exports. We would be willing to see how that might impact on our exports and reserve our rights under the WTO. But our basic preference is for a permanent and full exemption, because we really do not think there is a case to be made that these exports in any way damage America's national interest.
If you don't get that exemption on June 1st, what will you do?
If tariffs are imposed, we fully reserve our rights under the WTO to impose rebalancing tariffs on equivalent amounts of American exports, and we've already started the procedures in the WTO to make this possible if we get to that point, which is not where we want to be, and it's not the outcome that we wish for.
On Iran, realistically, is there a way to salvage the accord that the U.S. has pulled the plug on?
Yes, I think we have said very clearly, as have the other parties to the agreement, that as long as Iran maintains its part of the bargain and continues to respect the agreement, we will do everything we can to keep this agreement in place. It is an agreement which is not just agreed by the European Union, by 3 of our member states, and by Russia and China, but by the international community. It has been approved by a resolution of the UN Security Council. So this is actually a global agreement, not just something involving the United States and Iran. We deeply regret that the United States has taken the decision it has, but we are fully committed to implementing this agreement as long as Iran meets its side of the bargain. That
said, despite these reassurances, there is some skepticism that European countries would actually risk the ire of the United States as a result of this.
European companies, you mean?
Countries.
Countries. Mm-hmm. Countries, I think, are very clear. I think the question would be more accurate if you said that European companies who do business in the United States may feel they have to face a choice between doing business with Iran or doing business with the U.S., and that commercial choice will be made in due course by those companies. But there are many companies in Europe that don't do a lot of business in the United States. And by the way, we should not forget that there are Chinese and Indian and Russian companies who will step in. So one of the consequences of this could indeed be that some of the vacuum is taken by competitors of the United States and of Europe who could benefit from this decision.
We're, potentially on the brink of a trade war with China. What would you like to see the United States do here?
Well, I think that the United States is perfectly entitled to put on the table with its trading partners, whether that is China, whether that is Europe, or in the context of NAFTA, concerns that they have. I think the key issue, however, has to be that for these any discussions of this kind to be successful, you need to look for win-win outcomes. You need outcomes where everyone feels they come away with some additional benefit. And that is what I think we need to pursue in addressing any of these concerns, whether that's in dealing with China, whether that's dealing with between the United States and Europe. We also have many concerns with China. We share many of the administration's concerns with China, particularly on the conditions for doing business in China, conditions for investing in China, compulsory acquisition of intellectual property and so forth. And we would be happy to work with this administration and with China to see if we can find solutions to those structural problems, which are by far the most pressing for our industry.